March 1872, West Auckland, County Durham. A 7-year-old boy named Charles Edward Cotton fell violently ill after drinking tea prepared by his stepmother. His small body convulsed. He vomited repeatedly. Within 3 days, he was dead. The doctor examined the child's wasted frame, wrote gastric fever on the death certificate, and prepared to move on. It was a common enough diagnosis in Victorian England, but a parish official named Thomas Riley could not forget something Marianne Cotton had said just days before the boy's death. She had come to his office seeking admission to the workhouse. Riley had asked about the child. Marianne's response was chilling in its casualness. "I won't be troubled long. He'll go like all the rest have done." Riley remembered those words because by March 1872, Marianne Cotton had buried 3 husbands, a lover, her mother, and at least 11 of her own children. All had died of the same mysterious gastric fever, all after drinking her tea, all insured. Charles Edward Cotton would be her 21st victim. This is the story of Britain's first female serial killer, a woman who turned Victorian domesticity into a death sentence, who wielded arsenic as casually as a housewife wielded sugar, and who almost escaped justice for 20 years. Welcome to the dark Victorian kitchen of Mary Ann Cotton. Mary Ann Robson was born in October 1832 in the village of Low Moorsley, County Durham. She grew up in Britain's coalfield country, where men descended into the pits each morning and women prayed they would return each night. Her father was a miner. When Mary Ann was 14, he fell down a mine shaft and died. The family was plunged into poverty. Mary Ann learned early that survival in Victorian England meant marrying well, or at least marrying often. At 20, she wed William Mowbray, a labourer. They moved frequently, following work across the northeast. Mary Ann bore 5 children in quick succession. 4 died in infancy. The doctors called it natural causes. Childhood was perilous in the 1850s. But Mary Ann had discovered something useful. The British and Prudential Insurance Company would pay out on children's policies. A few shillings per week in premiums, 10 or 20 pounds upon death. For a woman perpetually in debt, it was a revelation. In 1864, William Mowbray fell ill with gastric problems. He died in agony. Mary Ann collected the insurance. She remarried within months. Her second husband was George Ward, an engineer. He lasted just 14 months before succumbing to the same mysterious gastric fever. Mary Ann collected another insurance payout. She was beginning to perfect her method. The pattern was established: marry, insure, poison, collect, repeat. Over the next 8 years, Mary Ann would bury 2 more husbands, numerous children, both her own and her stepchildren, her mother and a lover. Each death brought her a modest sum. Together, they funded a lifestyle slightly beyond her station. No one suspected. After all, she was just a grieving widow, a devoted mother, a caring nurse to the sick.
Mary Ann Cotton's weapon of choice was arsenic trioxide, a white, odorless powder that dissolved readily in tea. In Victorian England, arsenic was everywhere. Housewives bought it openly from chemists to kill rats and bedbugs. It was used in wallpaper dyes, creating fashionable green patterns that slowly poisoned entire households. Women applied arsenic compounds to their faces as cosmetics, seeking the pale complexion deemed beautiful. A shilling would buy enough arsenic to kill a dozen people. No questions asked, no records kept. Marianne exploited this ubiquity brilliantly. When neighbors noticed she always had arsenic on hand, she explained she was treating bedbug infestations. Perfectly reasonable. Victorian homes were plagued with vermin. The symptoms of arsenic poisoning mimicked common illnesses: violent vomiting, agonizing abdominal pain, relentless diarrhea, extreme thirst, convulsions. Doctors in the 1860s routinely diagnosed these symptoms as gastric fever, cholera, or natural childhood illness. Post-mortem examinations were rare. Autopsies were expensive and considered undignified. Marianne understood this. She also understood dosage. Too much arsenic would cause immediate violent death that might raise suspicions. Instead, she administered small doses over several days. Her victims suffered terribly, writhing in their beds, calling for water, begging for relief. But the progression seemed natural to Victorian physicians accustomed to seeing such suffering. Marianne played the role of devoted nurse perfectly. She would sit by the deathbed, mopping fevered brows, offering sips of water or more poisoned tea. Neighbors praised her dedication. Doctors thanked her for her attentive care. No one imagined that the gentle woman in the mourning dress was systematically murdering her own family. Why would they? She was a mother. In Victorian England, motherhood was sacred. Mothers were incapable of such evil, or so society believed.
The Victorian era witnessed an explosion in working-class life insurance. Friendly societies and companies like the British and Prudential offered policies to labourers, miners and factory workers who could afford only pennies per week in premiums. These policies were meant to prevent pauper burials, the greatest shame a Victorian family could suffer. A decent funeral cost several pounds. Without insurance, the dead ended in unmarked graves in communal pits. For a few pence weekly, insurance guaranteed a proper burial with a headstone. But the system had a fatal flaw. It allowed anyone to insure anyone else. A wife could insure her husband. A mother could insure her children. Multiple policies could be taken out on the same person with different companies. And crucially, there was no investigation of deaths. Present a death certificate, collect the money. Marianne Cotton understood this system intimately. She insured her husbands with multiple companies. She insured her children, her stepchildren, even her elderly mother. The premiums were small, the payouts mounted. When her third husband, James Robinson, discovered she had insured his children without his knowledge, he was disturbed enough to end the marriage, but not alarmed enough to report her to authorities. He simply wanted her gone. It was the closest Marianne came to exposure before 1872. Between 1852 and 1872, Marianne collected insurance payouts on at least 15 deaths. Historians estimate she gained perhaps £400 total, roughly £40,000 in today's currency. Not a fortune, but enough to lift her from grinding poverty into modest comfort. Enough to buy better lodgings, better clothes, occasional luxuries. The money never lasted long. Marianne spent freely, fell into debt, and then required another payout. The cycle was endless, and so the bodies mounted.
Charles Edward Cotton was 7 years old when his stepmother decided he was an inconvenience. The boy was the son of Mary Ann's fourth husband, Frederick Cotton, who had died of gastric fever in September 1871. Mary Ann had collected the insurance, but Charles Edward remained, a child to feed, to clothe, to care for. More importantly, his presence prevented Mary Ann from pursuing her next marriage prospect, a customs officer named John Quick Manning, who had expressed interest in her. Quick Manning had made it clear he would not take on another man's child. Mary Ann needed Charles Edward gone. In March 1872, she went to the parish office seeking to place the boy in the workhouse. Thomas Riley, the assistant overseer, was puzzled. Why would she want to dispose of the child when she could simply marry and take him along? Mary Ann's response was careless, almost casual. "I won't be troubled long. He'll go like all the rest have done." Riley found the comment odd, but did not pursue it. He had no authority to prevent a woman from placing her stepchild in the workhouse. Days later, Charles Edward fell ill. The symptoms were familiar to anyone who had witnessed arsenic poisoning, though no one recognized them as such. The boy vomited continuously, his stomach cramped with agonizing pain. He begged for water. His small body convulsed. Mary Ann sat by his bedside, the picture of a concerned stepmother. Dr. Kilbourne attended the child, but could do nothing. On March 12, 1872, Charles Edward Cotton died. Dr. Kilbourne, who had treated several of Mary Ann's family members for similar symptoms, nevertheless wrote gastric fever on the death certificate. But Thomas Riley remembered her words, and this time he acted.
Thomas Riley went to the police with his concerns. His report reached Dr. Kilbourne, who reconsidered the death he had so readily certified. Kilbourne refused to sign the burial order until further investigation. This was extraordinary. In Victorian England, doctors rarely questioned their own diagnoses, and authorities almost never investigated domestic deaths. But Riley's testimony about Mary Ann's chilling prediction troubled Kilbourne enough to act. He requested a post-mortem examination. Dr. Kilbourne performed the autopsy himself, assisted by a colleague. They removed Charles Edward's stomach and intestines, preserving them in jars for chemical analysis. The samples were sent to Dr. Thomas Scattergood at Leeds School of Medicine. Scattergood employed the Marsh test, a relatively new forensic technique developed in 1836 that could detect even minute quantities of arsenic. The test was simple but effective. Tissue samples were mixed with acid and zinc, producing arsine gas. When heated, the gas decomposed, leaving metallic arsenic deposits. The results were unambiguous. Charles Edward Cotton's organs contained massive quantities of arsenic, enough to kill him several times over. Dr. Scattergood found arsenic in the stomach, intestines, liver, and even bone tissue. The child had been systematically poisoned. The police arrested Mary Ann Cotton on July 18, 1872. She was charged with the murder of Charles Edward Cotton, but investigators had begun examining the trail of deaths in her wake. In West Auckland alone, 3 of her stepsons had died in 1871, 1872. Her husband, Frederick, had died. Her lover, Joseph Nattrass, had died, all of gastric fever. Authorities obtained exhumation orders. One by one, the bodies were dug up. Joseph Nattrass, arsenic. Robert Robeson Cotton, arsenic. Frederick Cotton, Jr., arsenic.
The evidence was overwhelming. Mary Ann Cotton had turned her home into a charnel house.
The trial of Mary Ann Cotton began on March 5, 1873, at Durham Assizes. The courtroom was packed. Public interest in the case was immense. Here was a woman, a mother, accused of poisoning her own children for insurance money. It violated every Victorian assumption about feminine nature. The prosecution was led by Sir Charles Russell, who would later become Lord Chief Justice. He presented a methodical case. Dr. Scattergood testified about the Marsh test results. Dr. Kilbourne described the symptoms he had witnessed. Thomas Riley recounted Mary Ann's damning words. The insurance policies were entered as evidence, showing Mary Ann's systematic approach. The defense argued that arsenic was so common in Victorian households that contamination was possible. Perhaps Charles Edward had accidentally ingested rat poison. Perhaps the wallpaper in his room had leached arsenic. But the quantities found in the boy's body made accident impossible. The prosecution also introduced evidence of Mary Ann's previous victims, though she was tried only for Charles Edward's murder. The jury heard about the exhumed bodies, the pattern of deaths, the insurance payouts. Mary Ann Cotton sat in the dock wearing deep mourning black. She maintained her composure for most of the trial, but occasionally wept. Whether from genuine emotion or calculated performance, no one could say. She did not testify in her own defense. Victorian law did not require it, and her solicitor wisely kept her silent. Her demeanor throughout was that of an aggrieved, misunderstood woman. On March 7, 1873, after deliberating for just 90 minutes, the jury returned a guilty verdict. The judge, Sir Thomas Archibald, donned the black cap. His sentencing was brief and uncompromising. Mary Ann Cotton would hang. She was led from the courtroom as spectators whispered. Some were shocked. Many were satisfied. Justice, they believed, had been served.
Mary Ann Cotton spent her final weeks in Durham jail, a grim Victorian prison that still stands today. She was held in the condemned cell, watched constantly by female warders. Despite her conviction, she maintained her innocence. In interviews with prison chaplains, she admitted to nothing. She claimed she was the victim of malicious gossip and circumstantial evidence. In her final days, Mary Ann wrote letters to her surviving daughter, who had been placed with relatives. The letters expressed maternal love and religious sentiment. Whether genuine or performative, they demonstrated Mary Ann's ability to inhabit the role of devoted mother, even as she awaited execution for murdering her children. The execution was scheduled for March 24, 1873. Public executions had been abolished in 1868, so Mary Ann would die behind prison walls. Only officials, journalists, and a small crowd of witnesses would be present. The executioner was William Calcraft, then 73 years old and nearing the end of a long career. Calcraft was notorious for his incompetence. He favored the short drop method, which caused death by slow strangulation rather than the quicker broken neck. On the morning of her execution, Mary Ann Cotton walked to the gallows in the prison yard. She wore a black silk gown. Witnesses reported she appeared calm, almost resigned. Calcraft placed the noose around her neck. He had miscalculated the drop. Whether through incompetence or deliberate cruelty remains debated.
When the trapdoor opened, Mary Ann's neck did not break. She died by strangulation, her body convulsing at the end of the rope for nearly 3 minutes. It was an agonizing death, not unlike the deaths she had inflicted on her victims. Some witnesses believed it was divine justice. Others simply found it grotesque. Mary Ann Cotton was buried within the prison grounds, in an unmarked grave.
The execution of Mary Ann Cotton did not end her story. It transformed her into something else, a cultural nightmare, a cautionary tale, a figure of grotesque fascination. Within days of her death, children across County Durham were singing a macabre nursery rhyme. Mary Ann Cotton, she's dead and she's rotten. She lies in her bed with her eyes wide open. Sing, sing, oh what can I sing? Mary Ann Cotton is tied up with string. The rhyme preserved her memory in the most unsettling way, through the voices of children, the very demographic she had victimized. Victorian society struggled to comprehend Mary Ann Cotton. She had killed at least 21 people, including 11 of her own children. By comparison, Jack the Ripper killed 5 confirmed victims. Yet Jack the Ripper is a household name worldwide, whilst Mary Ann Cotton remains relatively obscure. Why? Historians suggest several reasons. Jack the Ripper was male. His crimes were sexually violent. His victims were prostitutes. And, crucially, he was never caught. Mystery breeds fascination. Mary Ann Cotton was female. Her crimes were domestic. Her victims were family. And she was caught, tried, and executed. Her story had a resolution. It was also deeply uncomfortable. Victorian society needed to believe mothers were incapable of harming their children. Mary Ann Cotton shattered that illusion. It was easier to forget her. The case did lead to reforms. Insurance companies began requiring medical examinations before issuing policies. The sale of arsenic became more regulated, though it would take decades before truly effective controls were implemented. In 2016, 143 years after her execution, ITV produced a 3-part drama called Dark Angel, starring Joanne Froggatt, famous for playing virtuous lady's maid Anna Bates in Downton Abbey. The casting was deliciously ironic. The actress celebrated for portraying Victorian moral goodness now depicted Victorian evil incarnate. Mary Ann Cotton's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about gender, poverty, and systemic failure in Victorian England. She killed for money. Insurance payouts that totaled perhaps £40,000 in today's currency. Not a fortune, barely enough to lift her from poverty to modest respectability. Was she uniquely evil, or was she a product of a society that valued women only as wives and mothers, that offered them no economic independence, that made survival dependent on marriage and childbearing? Victorian women had almost no legal rights. They could not own property. They could not vote. Most could not earn enough to support themselves. Marriage was economic necessity, not romantic choice. When husbands died or marriages failed, women faced destitution or the workhouse. The insurance system offered a grim alternative. Mary Ann Cotton recognized this and exploited it with cold calculation. But the system itself created the opportunity. Easy access to arsenic made her crimes possible. Lax insurance regulations made them profitable. Medical ignorance allowed them to continue for 20 years. Society's refusal to imagine that mothers could harm their children provided perfect camouflage. Where does individual guilt end and systemic failure begin? Mary Ann Cotton made choices. She chose to poison children, her own children, for money. That is irredeemably evil. But Victorian England created the conditions that made her choices possible, profitable, and initially undetectable. Understanding this does not excuse her crimes. It does help explain how a woman could murder 21 people over 20 years before anyone suspected. If you are fascinated by the dark mysteries of the Victorian era, subscribe to Fogbound Victorian. We explore the crimes that shocked an empire, the killers who exploited its failures, and the victims who deserve remembrance. Was Mary Ann Cotton a monster, or was she created by the society that executed her? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, remember the victims, question the past, and I will see you in the next Fogbound mystery.